Welcome to Bonepile Miniatures. In this video, we will cover our club's landscape generator, which is what we use to set up our battlefield for Warhammer Fantasy battles. When you watch our battle reports on this channel, this is the method in which we use to set up the battlefields. And this video is part of a series that covers all of our club rules that you will see us using during our Warhammer battles. Besides this YouTube playlist, you can also see all of our rule supplements at our hobby blog at bonepileminiatures.com. Look under the Rule Supplements tab. But let's get into this landscape generator. So the first question you may be wondering is, why did we go through the trouble of making our own landscape generator? The answer is that we wanted something that was both thematic as well as random and customizable, and this method has all of those elements in it. Our generator has 11 steps that must be followed in order, and we are going to go through these steps as they are currently written on our hobby blog, bonepileminiatures.com. Step number 1. Roll 2d6 on the landscape chart. And here is the landscape chart that we use. There are 11 types on this list, and you know that on a 2d6, the most common scores are 6, 7, and 8. And so for those slots we have desert, grassland, and forest, which in our view are the most common landscape types you might find in the game. And then all the others decrease in commonality from there. Now the point of this roll is to create a theme for the entire battlefield, including all of the terrain that is to be placed on it. So this method may not be the best approach for those who have a small selection of terrain pieces, unless you have terrain pieces that can fit anywhere, regardless of the landscape setting. So if you only have a few pieces of terrain, then I would suggest going back to the 8th edition rulebook to set up your battlefield. But if you don't have much terrain selection, there are a couple of workarounds that you could try. The first one is to just simply re-roll on this chart until you get something that you have terrain pieces for. The second workaround is to simply put a piece of paper on the battlefield that represents a particular terrain piece. You don't really have to have a model of everything. A piece of paper could represent a hill or a forest or a sand trap or something, anything you need it to be. So that's always an option. But this takes care of the first step, which is really straightforward. Now we'll move on to step 2. Step 2 is the table size and difficulty chart. Let's zoom in to the top paragraph. It says, use this difficulty chart based upon your table size. The table size is your choice. The difficulty level is also your choice. Beginners should start with a small amount of terrain, and advanced players should use more. The chart indicates the amount of terrain that each player will select and place on the battlefield, assuming a 2-player game. Results of 1 to 15 points are possible. Only roll once on the chart and both players will get the same result. So now let's look at the chart. So the chart has a range of table sizes across the top, and then a range of difficulties down the left side. And then for each field in the matrix, the amount of terrain is indicated, usually determined by a dice roll. So the choice of difficulty is between you and your opponent. So you simply look up your table size and then choose a difficulty level, and then roll the dice. The dice score is the amount of terrain that both players will have. The next paragraph states, If you have more than 2 players in a game, decide amongst yourselves how to divide the responsibility to set up the battlefield. A few solutions are available. One option is to nominate 2 players among the many to set up the battlefield. Another option is to divide the 2d6 results evenly among the multitudes of players or teams, however seems fair or logical for your crew. A third or extreme option is to allow all players the full amount of terrain points scored on the 2d6 roll. So the reason why we put this table together was to give the players options based upon personal preference for how much terrain they like to see on their Warhammer battlefields. Step 3. Terrain features. And step 3 is not an action step, more of a step to understand going forward. We divide terrain features into 3 major categories: natural, unnatural, and scatter features. And these are very self-explanatory, but let me explain anyways. Natural features are not created by humans or any other Warhammer race. Examples include trees, rivers, hills, rocks, and more. Natural features should belong to a landscape. For example, a frozen waterfall is out of place in a desert, except by some magical explanation. Some of these features may have mysterious effects, explained in another step. Unnatural features are those created by Warhammer races. Common examples are walls, bridges, roads, shrines, huts, farms, towers, castles, and more. These features may be generic or have unique architecture for a specific race or civilization. Unnatural features usually should not outnumber natural features, except for near large towns or cities. These are typically the most interesting terrain features on a battlefield and can have major effects in a battle. Many will have mysterious effects. And then scatter terrain. They are features that are small and are generally treated like obstacles. They can be found anywhere and may not be particular to any landscape type. They include barrels, crates, wagons, signs, small rocks, and more. They could be either of natural or unnatural origin. Scatter terrain is typically used to decorate or simply make the landscape look more interesting with little details. They are usually of little consequence in the Warhammer battle, but special rules can be made for them as desired. So it's important to understand these differences because in the next few steps you will be selecting terrain from each of these categories. Step 4. The Terrain Limits Chart. So this chart basically takes the number that you rolled from the difficulty chart and divides it into the 3 different terrain categories. And then those numbers will tell you what you can spend or purchase under each category during the terrain selection step. And the purpose of this chart is to help keep the battlefield balanced and helps it look somewhat believable. But it is important to remember that these numbers are more like purchase points or spending points more than numbers of terrain items, and that will be explained in the next step. Step 5. Terrain costs. Terrain cost is based upon a combination of how big an item is and how commonplace it would be in your landscape setting. Rare items will cost more than common items. Nothing would prevent you from placing a frozen waterfall in a desert, but that would be more of a costly item since it would not be commonplace in that setting. Use the following chart to understand the 3 terrain cost categories. So the next couple of charts will be populated with a bunch of symbols, and this chart explains what those symbols mean. They represent an occurrence category, but the symbols also represent the cost of the item. The filled-in circle are common items, and they cost 1 terrain point. Half circles are less common, and they cost 2. And then empty circles are rare, and they cost 3. Each player will use the terrain limits chart for each terrain category to go shopping for terrain items to place. Terrain items selected are your choice. The landscape generator does not have a specific list of terrain, but merely a list of options to choose from. This allows for more creativity in building and collecting a terrain library that suits your club's interests. You also don't have to worry about randomly rolling for terrain items that you do not have in your collection. So here is the terrain chart for natural features. You will notice that there are different terrain items across the top, and then the different landscape settings down the left side. In the middle of the matrix are all the different cost symbols. So what you do is focus on the landscape setting that you rolled in step 1 and look across that row at the different terrain items. So for example, grasslands. Rivers and marshes would be common and therefore would only cost 1. Woods and hills would be less common and would cost 2. And then all the others would be rare and would cost 3. Now there's a few things that I do want to point out concerning this chart. First of all, the terrain items are very vague and ambiguous, not only as to type but also as to size. This allows for full flexibility and creativity. For example, the hill. It does not mention how tall it is, how wide it is, its shape or other dimensions. It does not matter if it's a scree slope or if it's grassy. Those details are all up to you. And then the same with the rivers. It does not mention how long they are, how wide they are, or any other information about them. The details are up to you. The river could be single-channeled, or it could be braided with many channels. It could have waterfalls. It doesn't matter. You are the creator and you are the player. Make it as you desire. The sky is the limit, literally. The second thing to note is that in your creativity, you may have an item that may not fit in one of these categories. All I can say is just do your best to fit it into one of them. For example, you may say, I have a pond. Where's the pond on the list? Well, I think a pond is very similar to a marsh. And so, in that case, I would suggest using the marsh category. Marsh could also include springs and bogs. Looking at the ice category, that could include glaciers, snow piles, or ice sheets. The cave category could include tunnels and pits. Sand could be quicksand, or beaches, or other sand traps. Cliffs could include 1 drop, or 2, or 3, or many more in close succession. Rivers could have flowing water, or lava, or tar, or slime, or whatever you imagine it to be. Even geysers and hot springs would fit into the marsh category. I think you would be hard-pressed to find something that does not fit into one of these columns. What if I have an item that would fit into one of 2 categories, like a sand dune? Would that be a hill or a sand feature? I think in that case I would put it under the hill category, but it doesn't really matter. The point of this chart is not to articulate every single possibility. And if you really do find an item that is not represented on this chart, there is a blank column to make up your own category and fill in the associated costs. And now the third thing to note. Try not to get too wrapped up into whether you agree or disagree with whether certain terrain items would be common, less common, or rare in different terrain settings. Believe me, I can think of plenty of exceptions to all of these occurrence designations as much as any of you can. For example, when I look at the lake setting, I can think of places that I have visited where caves nearby the lake are quite common. What may be rare in one part of the world may be common in another part of the world. But let's not get lost down that rabbit hole. This is just a game, and I made this chart with variety in mind. If you really want to make your own version of this chart that better suits your fancy, then go right ahead. But this is the chart as it stands in this landscape generator, and it is the one that we use in our club to set up our Warhammer battlefields. It's as simple as that. The final thing to note is that this is still just a reference chart. The selection procedure is not described here, but will be coming up shortly. But let's go ahead and look at the reference chart for the unnatural features. So the first thing that you will notice on this chart is that there is no reference to the landscape setting. That's because Warhammer races live everywhere. Just because humans wouldn't live somewhere, it doesn't mean another race would not. And once again, I tried to cover as many bases as I could with the different types of terrain features that Warhammer races could create. And I think that whatever you could come up with for unnatural terrain features would fit into one of these categories. You might say, what about a log mill and a log flume? To me, that would be very similar to a quarry or a mine. It just has more to do with wood. And so I think you can find something on this chart that fits with whatever you could create for your Warhammer world. Also to note is that there's still no reference on this chart to size and composition of the item that you want to place on the battlefield. Those details are up to you. There may also be different interpretations between different Warhammer races of what these features would look like. For example, an altar or a house or a tower may look different across the different Warhammer civilizations. The details are up to you. And now the paragraph does explain that if you have a particular scenario that you want to play where these commonplace designations do not work, then go ahead and make the adjustments to the chart that fit the scenario. For example, if you are trying to play a game near a large settlement or a city, then you may want to adjust the town buildings to be more commonplace instead of rare. But you and your opponent would have to agree to that before starting this procedure. But in general, I tried to build this list in a way that reflects how most players build their terrain collection. Most of us start with simple projects like walls and fences, and then we get more elaborate from there, all the way up to castles and forts, which are the most rare. But the great thing about this method is that you do not have to worry about the items that you do not own, because you make all the selections. Now let me show you the last chart before we get to the selection process. And this is for the scatter features. And this one is really easy. All scatter features are worth 1 point, because they're all roughly the same size and could occur anywhere. This chart only gives a few examples. Examples include a lone tree, a bush, a rock, a pillar, sign, carcass, barrel, crate, stump, wagon, cow, campfire, grave, coin pile, boat, crops. The options are limitless. You could also try statues, haystacks, tools, coffins, gallows, anything you can imagine. They are all worth 1 point. Some may have mysterious effects. Some may not. You are the creator and you are the player. The choice is yours. And so that wraps up all the reference charts that you will need to choose terrain features. Now we'll get into the selection procedure, as well as the placement. Let me read from step number 9. Roll off to see who will place a terrain piece first. Then alternate between players. Player 1 chooses and places his first terrain piece first. Then player 2 chooses and places his terrain piece. Then go back to player 1, so on and so forth until all items are placed. There are no limits on duplicate selections. Both players will place all of their natural features first. Then they will place the unnatural features. Finally, scatter items will be placed. Within each feature class, each player should place the most expensive items first. If a player spends all of their points within a feature category before the other player, then he continues to the next feature class. Continue until both players spend all of their points in each terrain feature class. In other words, one player does not have to wait for the other player to finish a feature class before they move on to their next one. For example, if I place one big, large natural feature on the table first, and then my opponent wants to spend his points on a bunch of little ones, I don't have to wait for him to finish before I continue with the unnatural features. And so you can see here that there are no rules on what you can select. It is all your choice. Just look at what's available in your collection and make the choice. If you want a river, then place a river. If you don't want a river, then don't place one. The only restriction is that each player has spending limits within each of the categories. So you will have to reference the number that you rolled on the difficulty chart, as well as how that breaks down among the different terrain feature classes, and then spend your feature points according to your landscape setting. You may be thinking, how big can my river be? Or how big can my forest be? Or my tower? Or my farm? The answer is, it's up to you. A lot of it will probably depend upon the size of your table. You would want it to be proportional to your table size, with the number of terrain items that you will have to select. You may also have to consider your army sizes, or how much of a challenge you are looking for from the terrain. That's why there are no rules for this, because each scenario may be different. Also, player preference may be different. You build the world that you want to create within a landscape theme. The purchase points are a way to make sure that one player doesn't dominate over the other on terrain selection. And the different terrain categories helps to ensure that the landscape looks believable or credible, even though it is a fantasy game. And so the next section covers placement on the table. And in our club, we prefer random placement. But in our club, we actually enjoy terrain being in the way. It is almost like a third player and helps mix up the strategy of each game. We think it's enjoyable to watch how each general uses or avoids different types of terrain. And so we like the terrain to be placed randomly. They could be anywhere and could be right in someone's way, ruining their tactical mojo. But like I said, we think that is part of the fun of this game. We know that not everybody is like that, but this is what we do. So let me explain random placement, or at least how we do it. So what we do is divide the table into an imaginary grid like you see here, with D6 divisions per side. and the divisions must be evenly spaced per side. For example, on this 4x8 table, the short side will have 8-inch divisions, and then the long side will have 16-inch divisions. And then you just simply roll 2d6. But make sure before you roll that you know which die corresponds to which side. You could choose to roll 2 different colors of dice, or just roll them one at a time, and declare which side each one belongs to. And before you roll, you must indicate which corner will be the 0. And then you just simply count the grid spaces according to the 2d6 roll. For example, if I rolled a 3 for my short side and a 4 for my long side, and then I used the bottom left corner as my 0, then this would be my intersection point. However, we do take this sequence one step farther. After you find this initial position, you roll the scatter and artillery dice together, and then you move the terrain piece according to that roll from the initial position. And then the orientation or the spin of the terrain item is up to the player who is placing it. And then we recommend that you choose a different corner for each terrain item that you need to place. We like to go clockwise around the table, that way each corner gets used. If you always use the same corner, you will develop some edge effects, since you will never score a 0 on your d6 roll. And that's what we did with this table that I'm showing you right now. I don't think there's any noticeable edge effects on it. Now, in the rare occasion that 2 terrain items end up on top of each other through this random placement procedure, you can choose to either re-roll or just use your artistic interpretation to place them next to each other in a way that makes the most sense. For example, we had a situation where a river landed on top of a forest. So we thought the simple thing to do here was to have the river coming out of the forest, like there was some kind of a spring inside. So I recommend just looking for the simplest solution to terrain overlaps. And while we're looking at this river, I'd like to point out one more fun option. Even though I mentioned that we typically like to have the player who places the terrain piece choose the orientation, there's some cases like with rivers that we like to use the scatter dice to point a random direction from where the river should flow. And that's what we did here. And some rivers, like this one, have multiple modular segments. And so we like to roll the scatter die for each segment. And that gives the river a chance to scroll and to meander across the landscape. You could do a similar thing with roads or anything else that's kind of a line feature. And now another point to bring up while we are looking at the river is that some items do not benefit from a completely random placement. For example, a bridge over a river. The bridge cannot just be anywhere. It has to be on the river. But it could be on a random spot on the river. So what we would do is we would designate one endpoint of the river as the 0. And then roll a d6 or maybe a 2d6 to determine how many segments or maybe inches from that 0 point to place the bridge. So that will make sure that the bridge is on the river, but on a random spot on the river. And now the final step to this process is to determine which terrain pieces are mysterious terrain. For example, on this battlefield, there's a couple of forests and some hills. Are they mysterious or are they normal? So we have a way that we determine that. So reading from this procedure, whoever finished placing terrain last will start this phase. Alternating turns, each player chooses a terrain piece and makes a d6 roll. On a 4+, the terrain item is mysterious. Otherwise, it has no mysterious effects. But then the exact mystery is found out like normal during the game when a unit steps inside of the terrain piece. So after that, the next player will choose another terrain item and roll for that one. Each terrain item can only be selected once by either player, and then the limit to how many times each player can roll is indicated on the difficulty chart found way back on step 2. For example, if you chose an intermediate game, each player will be able to roll 3 times for mysterious terrain. Now, some items may inherently possess magical effects and are designed and selected as such, like a charnel pit, a sphinx, or a magical portal. There is no need to roll for these features. But not all terrain types are all magical. Not all towers are magical. Walls and fences, wells, houses, shrines, altars and monuments are not always magical. There is nothing wrong with having a monument that is not magical. For most of these items you can roll for mysterious terrain. But if you and your opponent agree that a specific terrain item should automatically come with its magical powers, then there is no need to roll for mysterious terrain. There's not really a fixed rule when it comes to this. Use a combination of randomness and good old-fashioned fun to determine mysterious terrain. While this mysterious terrain procedure can be used for anything, it was mainly intended for woods, rivers, hills, walls, ruins, and potentially other arcane architecture. And then when it comes to specific mysteries, we do have some big lists of mysterious forests, hills, rivers, and other items on our hobby blog at bonepileminiatures.com. And so with this, we are ready for deployment now. The battlefield is all set up. And so for deployment, both players will roll off to see who deploys first. In fact, the winner of the roll-off will decide who will start deploying first. And then the person who deploys first will select the deployment zone of their choice. But then we also allow that if there is mysterious terrain in your deployment zone, then you can find out after full deployment, but before the game starts, what the exact mystery is for that terrain piece. We assume that the general would send a scout over to that terrain item and find out what the mystery is. And then finally, there is an option in our club to include night and or weather rules to modify the game experience even further. If you choose to use these options, you would determine night and weather effects after army deployment, but before the first turn of the game. I think we're going to cover our night and weather rules in another video. I think this one has gone on long enough. And we will also make the night and weather rules available on our hobby blog when we release that video. So look out for that coming up in the near future. But this is the end for our instructions on this landscape generator. Whether you adopt these rules or not for your games, this will give you some insights on how we in our club set up the battlefields for our Warhammer Fantasy games. And we think that this has always produced good results for us in setting up a good, balanced, and fun battlefield for our games. And I hope that it'll work out for you too. So thank you for watching this video and joining me on this little side tangent. And I hope that you'll join us for the next one.